Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. New Fairfield didn't see much chaos. Until the morning, a house went up in flames, and someone inside didn't scream. It was April 27th, 2024. A Saturday. Quiet, the kind of quiet New England towns are known for, until something breaks it. At exactly 5:19 a.m., a neighbor on Wood Creek Road made a call to 911. Her voice was steady, but her words weren't casual. "There's smoke coming from the Fairchild's house. A lot of it, but I don't see anyone outside." Firefighters from the new Fairfield Volunteer Department arrived on scene within 7 minutes. The structure, a modest two-story home tucked into the tree line, was already half consumed on the first floor. Entry was forced through the side door. Inside, they found her. The body of 60-year-old Gaindawati Bindu Fairchild was located near the living room hearth. She was lying supine, arms curled close to her chest, as if asleep, but there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no furniture overturned. Just one woman, fully clothed, barefoot, with no visible burns to the face or hands, and no pulse. She was declared deceased at 5:41 a.m. The fire was extinguished within the hour. Initial assumption: accidental electrical fault, possibly space heater or fireplace. But even at the scene, inconsistencies mounted. First, the smell. Accelerant-trained dogs signaled on two separate floorboards near the center of the living room. Areas investigators noted were oddly charred compared to adjacent zones. Second, the victim's placement. She wasn't near a known exit point, yet showed no evidence of escape behavior, no soot on hands, no bruising on knuckles, and most critically, no blackening around the nostrils or mouth. She hadn't inhaled smoke. Which raised the question, did she die before the fire? At 8:15 a.m., her husband, 66-year-old John Fairchild, arrived at the property. Dressed in khakis, untucked polo, and a windbreaker, he stepped out of his 2012 Hyundai Sonata and asked the first responder, "Is it true? Did she not make it?" Fairchild told officers he'd left the house earlier that morning to pick up breakfast from a Dunkin' off Route 39. He couldn't remember the time. Said he let her sleep in and figured she'd call if she needed anything. His demeanor was calm, not overly emotional, not shocked. When officers asked where the receipt for breakfast was, he tapped his pockets and said he must have left it in the car. There was no receipt in the car. Autopsy was ordered the same day. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Farmington, CT, performed the post-mortem the following afternoon. Preliminary findings were enough to send the fire report to cold case protocol. No soot in the airway, no blistering on the trachea or lungs. Slight cranial edema. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region, non-lethal but suspicious. Time of death estimated between 1 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m. Toxicology, negative for alcohol, sedatives, or opioids. The official cause of death, undetermined. But what stood out most in the report was the forensic phrase highlighted in bold at the end. Subject appears to have expired prior to flame exposure. This meant homicide couldn't be ruled out, which meant jurisdiction shifted from fire marshal to major crimes. Investigators began to piece together the hours leading to the blaze. Bindu Fairchild had no known enemies. She didn't work outside the home. Neighbors described her as quiet, polite, and barely seen. She didn't drive, rarely went out. Her life, by all accounts, was confined to the home she shared with John for more than 2 decades. No signs of forced entry, no missing items, nothing stolen. Even her wallet, untouched, sat on the kitchen counter beside a glass of half-melted ice water. Her phone was found in the bedroom, no recent calls or messages. Fire origin analysis pointed to 2 distinct points of ignition, one in the corner of the living room and another near the laundry doorway. Both had traces of accelerant. That ruled out accident, that turned the fire into arson, and that made Bindu's death suddenly look less like tragedy and more like a cover-up. John Fairchild was not arrested, at least not yet. But detectives from the Western District Major Crimes Squad filed a search warrant by the end of April for the couple's financials, electronics, and phone records. They also pulled security camera footage from neighboring homes. Only 2 houses on Wood Creek Road had cameras. Neither had angle on the Fairchild residence. Yet the absence of footage was, in itself, a detail. As one investigator noted in the incident log, No motion-triggered activity between 12:30 a.m. and 5:15 a.m. Either the suspect moved silently or the fire was meant to erase whatever noise came before. There was something else, small but unsettling. When reviewing the body cam footage from the first responders, one fireman was heard telling a paramedic offhand, "She looked like she was just waiting." But for what? The first time I reviewed the postmortem report, I had to read it twice. Not because it was complicated, but because it was clean. Too clean. There were no defensive wounds, no bruising to suggest restraint, no smoke in the airway, no burns on the hands or face. The victim had died inside a burning house, but not from the fire. That's what set this case apart. April 28, 2024, just one day after the fire. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Farmington released the preliminary forensic pathologist's assessment on Gindawati Bindu Fairchild. The results prompted the Western District Major Crime Squad to reclassify the death as suspicious and open a full criminal investigation into both the fire and the circumstances surrounding the body. Here's what they found. Cause of death? Undetermined. Manner of death? Pending. No carbon monoxide in the bloodstream. No soot in the lungs. No thermal injuries on major organs. The most notable detail was a small but significant subgaleal hematoma, a shallow pooling of blood between the scalp and skull at the rear base of her head. Not enough to kill her, but enough to confirm blunt force trauma occurred before death. Toxicology returned negative across all major drug classes: opiates, sedatives, alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, no overdose, no sleeping aid, no evidence she'd been chemically incapacitated. The forensic pathologist's line read, "Victim was likely unconscious or deceased prior to ignition. Absence of soot in upper airways supports this conclusion." When Bindu was recovered, her body temperature was still within post-mortem active cooling stage. Investigators used the Hen sphygmogram, adjusting for ambient conditions and scene temperature. Time of death was placed between 1:30 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. The fire wasn't reported until 5:19 a.m. That gave someone at least 2 hours between the time of death and the ignition event. Enough time to stage a scene, enough time to leave unnoticed. It also raised the question, if the fire wasn't accidental, what exactly was it hiding? By May 1st, the fire marshal and crime scene analysts re-entered the residence, this time under search warrant. A full scene reconstruction began with thermal mapping, accelerant detection, and structural layout documentation. The point of origin, based on charring intensity and burn direction, was the east corner of the living room, approximately 4 feet from the body. Chemical sniffer units detected traces of isopropyl alcohol and denatured ethanol, both commonly available household items, but also known accelerants. No spilled containers were found. In the laundry hallway, a second heat signature matched a smaller ignition zone. Unnatural burn patterns indicated deliberate placement, not appliance failure. Fire engineers noted that the two burn areas were not connected by natural flame migration. They had been started independently. This meant two things. The fire had been set intentionally. It had been designed to consume specific zones, but not the entire house. The bedroom, notably, was untouched. In the northeast hallway, where soot had lightly settled on intact baseboards, analysts lifted a partial footwear impression, a soft rubber sole with herringbone tread. It was the only usable print in the entire house. The print was left-facing, pointed toward the living room, not away from it. A further discovery came during wall cavity scans. One of the fire crews reported an electrical box that appeared tampered with, its cover removed, wires exposed, but no evidence of short-circuiting. It had nothing to do with the fire's cause, but it raised a new possibility. Someone may have staged an electrical fault as misdirection. No tools were found at the scene. Digital forensics began quietly in parallel. An Amazon Echo Dot, located on the kitchen counter, had last been activated via voice command at 11:42 p.m. the night before. The phrase, "Alexa, what time is it?" The device log showed no further voice activity, no alarms, no music commands, and no motion-linked recordings. But what stood out to the cyber team wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. The Echo had been manually disconnected from Wi-Fi at approximately 12:03 a.m. That was not a factory reset. That was someone accessing the settings app from a paired device and disabling the network. A deliberate act. In most homes, Alexa hears everything. In this one, someone had ensured she didn't. Next, the smart meter. Eversource provided electricity usage data for the home in 15-minute increments. The results showed something that didn't quite add up. Between 1:15 a.m. and 2:45 a.m., power consumption dropped by 60% compared to the same hours from the previous 5 nights. The only time that type of drop occurred historically, when the home was unoccupied. Yet Bindu's body was found inside, fully dressed, no signs of movement, so either she was already dead, or someone cut power to mask activity. As the datasets grew, the investigative team began to lay out the timeline. Not a story, not a theory, a sequence. 11:42 p.m. Last confirmed voice command from Bindu. 12:03 a.m. Echo dot manually disabled. 1:15, 2:45 a.m. Drop in energy usage. 1:30 to 3:00 a.m. Estimated time of death. 5:19 a.m. Fire is reported by neighbor. 5:41 a.m. Body declared deceased. 8:15 a.m. Husband returns to scene. None of the timestamps conflicted. That was what bothered lead detective Jared Stone. The timeline was perfect, too perfect. The data aligned too cleanly. And that was the problem. When Stone re-interviewed the husband, now 5 days later, he asked a simple question. Did Bindu usually turn off the Wi-Fi when she went to bed? John Fairchild blinked, then said he didn't know how to do that. Said she wasn't really into technology. That she didn't even use the Echo much. But she had. That very night, at 11:42 p.m., just minutes before it went silent, and she'd asked what time it was. She died quietly, but she hadn't always lived that way. The autopsy told us how Gaindawati Bindu Fairchild likely died, unconscious or already deceased before the fire, but it told us nothing about who she was. That part was harder to reconstruct, because Bindu didn't leave behind a diary or a trail of posts on social media. No close friends in town, no job, no children. Her public footprint was minimal, almost deliberate. To understand how someone disappears without ever going missing, you have to go backward. And for Bindu, that meant starting decades before the fire. Bindu was born in 1964 in Georgetown, Guyana. She immigrated to the United States in the early 1990s on a legal work visa. Her education, according to U.S. immigration records, included training as a practical nurse. In 1998, she became a permanent resident. Public health employment records in New York confirm she worked for several years in elder care facilities in Queens and later in Yonkers. In 2001, she married John Theodore Fairchild in Westchester County, New York. They relocated to New Fairfield, Connecticut the following year. Property records show they jointly purchased the 2-story home on Wood Creek Road in 2002 for $287,000. They lived there together for 22 years. Those are the facts. What came next was harder to trace, because almost no one knew her. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood within 3 days of reclassifying the case. Interviews with residents on Wood Creek Road yielded similar responses. We didn't know her well. She kept to herself. We'd see her in the yard maybe twice a year. No one had seen Bindu outside the house since the previous fall. One neighbor thought she'd gone back to New York to visit family, but there were no travel records to support that. There was no family listed in the area. A distant cousin in Toronto was eventually contacted, but she hadn't spoken to Bindu in over 6 years. Inside the home, Bindu's belongings were concentrated in 2 rooms, the master bedroom and the kitchen. Her clothes were organized but limited. No recent purchases. A folder found in the nightstand contained immigration paperwork, utility bills, and old insurance forms, but nothing recent, no journal entries, no planner, no saved letters. But one document stood out, a family court packet, partially filled, dated February 2024. It was an initial petition for dissolution of marriage. Her name was on the form. The rest of it was blank. The copy had been folded once and showed light burn marks at the edges. She never filed it. By May 5th, investigators contacted a former co-worker from Bindu's days as a home health aide in Yonkers. The woman recalled that Bindu had spoken often of wanting to live somewhere quiet and be done with noise. She hadn't heard from her since 2003. The working theory was forming. Bindu had isolated herself, but maybe not by choice. A former real estate agent who'd helped the Fairchilds purchase their home told detectives that Bindu didn't speak much during the tour, and that John did most of the talking. No financial accounts were held in Bindu's name after 2011. From that point on, everything, utilities, mortgage, credit, ran through John Fairchild's accounts. Financial analysts within the investigative team were now tracking a trail of control. Tax records showed Bindu had not filed a return independently in over a decade. Her name was not attached to any independent lines of credit. A subpoena to Eversource confirmed that only John's credentials were authorized on the account. Even the smart devices in the home, like the Alexa and Wi-Fi routers, were registered under John's email. Her phone, a prepaid Samsung model found in the bedroom, had no SIM card activity after April 20th. Call logs were nearly empty. Investigators confirmed the phone was not linked to any app accounts, location services were disabled, and browsing history had been cleared. The device was essentially a shell. She didn't just live off the grid, one investigator noted. She was pushed to the edge of it. Detectives also discovered something unexpected during a digital deep dive. Bindu had, at one point, used a Gmail account under a maiden variation of her name, G. Ramsarup. The account had been dormant for years, but in March 2024, it had been reactivated on a laptop linked to the home's IP address. 2 emails were sent that week, one to a divorce attorney in Danbury, one to an employment agency in Bridgeport. Neither email received a reply, but both messages were still saved in the Sent folder, and both were timestamped between 2 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m., a strange window for someone to be emailing professionals. Investigators suspect the messages were drafted earlier and only sent when she found brief access to the home's network. The laptop itself was not found during the search. It had either been removed or destroyed. By mid-May, a clearer profile was emerging. Bindu was a legal immigrant, a licensed worker, a married woman with no public enemies. But over the course of 2 decades, she had slowly vanished from everything except the records that tethered her to someone else's name. The act of removing a person from their own life rarely starts with violence. It starts with restrictions: who you call, what you earn, what you control. For Bindu, those restrictions weren't documented with bruises or restraining orders. They were buried in silence, and eventually in fire. One investigator put it plainly: she didn't vanish, she was erased, quietly, systematically, and with no one watching. You learn quickly in fire investigation, flames don't just destroy, they leave patterns, measurable, traceable, and often incriminating. Not every fire is a message, but when someone dies before the first spark, the scene becomes more than debris. It becomes a cover story written in soot. On May 6, 2024, state fire investigators and members of the Connecticut State Police Arson Division re-entered 49 Wood Creek Road for a second forensic survey. This was no longer about fire origin. It was about uncovering what the fire was trying to erase. The fire had originated in 2 distinct locations: the living room's eastern corner and the laundry hallway. Both were confirmed in the initial suppression report, but this time, investigators brought in structural fire behavior analysts and accelerant-trained K-9s to map heat progression and examine combustion residue. One important thing stood out. The ceiling damage in the living room formed a clear upward V pattern from the floor, a classic indicator of a deliberately set low-point ignition. Investigators confirmed that the fire traveled up from a specific spot between 2 chairs near the window, but neither chair had been the source. The floor beneath them had anomalous burn depth, with charring inconsistent with natural flame spread. A circular scorch mark about 14 inches wide had penetrated deeper than any other area in the house. That wasn't normal for a wood frame home built in the early 2000s. Investigators tested the subfloor and found residual traces of denatured alcohol. The concentration suggested it had been poured and ignited in place. There was no candle, no tipped-over appliance, no malfunction. The same signature appeared in the second ignition zone by the laundry, different layout, same accelerant, same intent. The team flagged both areas as purposefully targeted burn points. No attempt to torch the entire house, just enough to create the illusion of chaos. As debris was cleared from the living room, analysts located 3 key items: a partially melted butane lighter embedded between floor joists near the ignition V, a ceramic mug fused to vinyl tile, contents charred but traceable to an antacid drink powder, suggesting it belonged to the victim, possibly her last drink. A metal thumbtack with a fragment of orange plastic, later confirmed to be a piece of a smoke detector casing. The presence of the smoke detector casing mattered more than it seemed. Because the home originally had 3 smoke detectors, living room, hallway, and upstairs landing, but only one was intact and functional when firefighters arrived, the upstairs unit. The other 2 had been disabled. Forensic electrical engineers inspected the alarm circuit and found evidence of manual disconnection. The wall-mounted units had been unscrewed. No signs of failure, no melted wires. Just a clean cutoff. The hallway detector's mounting plate was found under a pile of charred laundry, untouched by flame. This told investigators something very specific. Whoever set the fire made sure no alarm would go off until the blaze was fully engaged. That wasn't panic, that was process. A separate layer of analysis focused on heat damage sequencing. Digital heat sensors positioned throughout the room allowed a 3D thermal reconstruction. Based on residual carbon scoring and ignition temperatures, the model showed that the living room fire was hotter and burned longer, while the hallway fire fizzled out within 6 minutes, never sustaining long enough to catch the walls. That imbalance suggested one was the main fire, and the other a secondary distraction, intended to suggest accidental overload or spontaneous failure. But no wiring fault, dryer malfunction, or breaker surge was detected. That left only manual ignition as explanation. Investigators used FLIR, forward-looking infrared imaging, to scan beams and load-bearing elements that hadn't collapsed. In the baseboard space behind the couch, 6 feet from the ignition point, they found trace human DNA on the wall surface. The sample was collected and entered into CODIS. At the time of reporting, no external match was returned. But internal comparison confirmed the DNA did not belong to Bindu Fairchild. In the middle of that room, investigators pulled one last item from beneath the floor vent. It was a partial dental flosser, burned at one end, but intact enough to retain saliva. The brand was generic, sold in dollar stores, no unique identifiers, but it was sent for DNA extraction. Here's why it mattered. Bindu didn't have dental issues. Her dental records showed full natural teeth, no bridges, no work requiring flossers. The item had not melted, meaning it had been used or dropped after the fire started cooling. Possibly during re-entry. Whoever returned to that room may have believed the fire had erased everything. It hadn't. In the final scene report submitted May 12, the fire marshal included a single-line observation beneath all the forensic documentation. Heat movement was inconsistent with flashover. Object staging suggests familiarity with fire suppression timing. In simpler terms, this was not the work of an amateur, but not a professional arsonist either. It was someone who understood just enough about fire to manipulate perception and just little enough to underestimate what would survive. The fire was fast, controlled, and deeply specific. As the team cleared out, one of the fire investigators, retired Army, now 10 years in arson, turned to lead detective Jared Stone and said something that would stay in the report's margins. People don't burn houses for no reason. If they want to hide something, they usually already did something worse. There's a rule in digital forensics: the smallest device can hold the biggest turn in a case. In this one, it was a black Samsung Galaxy Tab A, model year 2020, recovered from a bedroom drawer in the secondary Danbury residence tied to John Fairchild. It had no passcode, no screen lock. It powered on instantly. The device was found during a search executed under warrant on May 14, 2024, nearly 3 weeks after the fire. Detectives were acting on a hunch that if the primary residence had been burned, anything worth hiding might still be accessible elsewhere. The Danbury property, a small rented apartment linked to John's name, wasn't previously declared as a secondary address. It came up in background checks through a separate utility billing account that had remained active since late 2023. No furniture, no food, no photographs, just a folding chair, a coffee maker, and the tablet in a nightstand drawer. That tablet contained files that shifted the investigation's trajectory. Within 2 hours of processing, the State Police Digital Crimes Unit retrieved more than 200 media files from the device. 73 were flagged for expedited review. Of those, 12 were confirmed as child sexual abuse material, CSAM, with embedded metadata matching previously identified victims in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC database. Each file contained geotags or server call traces from late March through mid-April 2024. The same time frame Bindu Fairchild was reportedly isolated at home and drafting unfiled divorce paperwork. The files had been downloaded from encrypted forums. Investigators matched server logs from those forums to a Connecticut IP address registered under an account tied to John's name. All downloads occurred between midnight and 3:00 a.m., the same time block that Bindu was likely killed. The connection to the fire wasn't immediate, but the pattern was. Someone using the Danbury apartment, presumably John Fairchild, was not only accessing explicit illegal material, but doing so at a time when Bindu was trying to leave the marriage. The divorce email discovered in Chapter 3 was sent from a network traced back to the Fairchild home. The very same week, the tablet showed login entries and downloads consistent with compulsive, repeated behavior. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a convergence. Digital forensic experts didn't just stop at media files. They examined browser caches, keyboard strokes, and app history. The tablet's usage was narrow. No banking apps, no photo albums, no email clients, just a browser, 2 side-loaded file storage apps, and a third-party clearing tool used to purge logs after each session. But one error stood out: a thumbnail preview in a gallery folder that had not been deleted. A single image that contained Bindu's face, captured in poor lighting, eyes closed. The file was corrupted. Analysts couldn't determine the exact timestamp, but EXIF data placed the image creation between April 22nd and April 25th within 48 hours before the fire. The image had no visible injuries, no context, but its presence on a hidden device, stored away from the shared home, raised serious concern among the forensic team. It was noted in the case file as psychological leverage content. This wasn't just evidence of possession, it hinted at control. On June 3, 2024, John Fairchild was brought in for a formal recorded interview. He was not under arrest. He was informed of the evidence found. He denied owning the tablet, claimed the apartment was used for storage, gave no further explanation. When asked if he knew how the files got there, he invoked his right to counsel. Shortly after, the state's attorney's office in Danbury filed charges for third-degree possession of child sexual abuse material, a felony under Connecticut law. John was booked and released on $10,000 bail. The criminal charge was public. The link to Bindu's death remained sealed under investigative privilege. But internally, the team shifted priorities. The fire had been a deliberate act. The victim's last days showed isolation and a desire to escape. And now digital proof had surfaced that the person closest to her, legally and physically, was hiding content that suggested obsession, deception, and risk. One of the investigators, reviewing the case progression chart on a whiteboard, drew a short line between the fire and the tablet folder and circled it in red. Then he wrote, "She saw something she wasn't supposed to." Some stories don't unravel. They peel, layer by layer, detail by detail, until the image that once seemed whole becomes a collection of concealed fragments. That's what happened when investigators started tracing John Fairchild's life beyond what was visible on paper. Because the man who appeared stable, retired USPS worker, mortgage co-holder, spouse of 22 years, wasn't actually living one life. He was living two. On June 10, 2024, following the digital evidence from the tablet and the arson findings, investigators initiated a full forensic audit of John Fairchild's financial and behavioral footprint. The objective was straightforward: determine whether his actions in the months leading to Bindu's death showed signs of concealment, preparation, or escalation. The results were conclusive. Banking records showed that John maintained 3 separate checking accounts, one joint with Bindu, one private under his full name, and one under the name J.T. Faulkner, an alias he used in online correspondence. That third account had been active since 2022, mostly funded through small cash deposits and app-based transactions. It was used primarily for purchases from anonymized vendors, VPN services, and encrypted cloud storage subscriptions. The account also made recurring payments to a mail forwarding drop address in Danbury, not connected to any of his listed residences. The name on the forwarding box, Japers Bus Faulkner. That was the first sign that John had been operating with intent to compartmentalize his activities. The postal records matched the pattern. As a former employee of the USPS, John understood the system. He had requested mail redirection orders multiple times between 2022 and early 2024. Some were legitimate, change of address after Bindu's medical treatment, but others rerouted sensitive envelopes to the Danbury apartment or the drop box. Investigators also recovered 2 burner phones, purchased under cash transactions at different locations in the state. One of the phones had login credentials to a secondary Proton Mail account. This inbox contained two key threads. One, a subscription confirmation for a site flagged by Interpol for hosting illegal content. Two, an encrypted message exchange with an unknown user regarding clearing data before exit. The last login timestamp on that account, April 26, 2024, at 11:54 p.m., roughly 5 hours before the fire was reported. On the home insurance side, detectives uncovered an updated fire policy rider added in January 2024. The rider increased the payout value on interior contents by 40%, citing recent electronics upgrades. There was no documentation of new purchases, no receipts, no matching items recovered from the scene. The payout claim was submitted 3 days after Bindu's body was found. The request was denied, pending investigation. One of the more overlooked discoveries came during a forensic imaging of John's primary desktop computer located at the Danbury property. Buried in a secondary user profile was a PDF labeled MedRef 2023. When decrypted, it revealed scanned copies of Bindu's immigration file, her social security card, and medical records from 2017, none of which had been used for any legal or insurance purposes since. There was no immediate explanation for why those files had been retained in that location. But investigators noted the presence of metadata edits made just weeks before Bindu's death. It was logged as potential identity access or fraud prep. The personal details kept mounting. A former USPS colleague, interviewed on June 12th, recalled that John had become paranoid during the pandemic, said he started working fewer hours, spoke often about security, and referenced locking things down before they go bad. The colleague dismissed it at the time, but looking back, it fit the pattern: withdrawal, secrecy, and long-game planning. The final piece came from a surveillance video pulled from a gas station in Ridgefield on April 26, the day before the fire. Timestamp, 9:17 p.m. The footage showed John entering the store, purchasing 2 gallons of isopropyl alcohol and paying in cash. He used a hat and mask, standard for the time, but still an attempt at low profile. The store had no record of purchase retention, but the footage, coupled with forensic analysis of the accelerant used at the crime scene, made the implication clear. None of this definitively proved murder, but it stripped away any image of innocence. By June's end, the team had mapped out a parallel profile for John Fairchild, one defined by alias financial activity, segregated digital identities, controlled physical spaces, and preemptive asset protection. It wasn't behavior rooted in confusion. It was compartmentalized, practiced, and maintained for years. As one investigator said during the briefing, people don't just wake up and start burning things. That behavior starts in how they store secrets and how they get used to living inside them. By the start of 2025, the public narrative was fractured. To most outside observers, John Fairchild was a recently widowed man, quiet, nondescript, awaiting answers from investigators who hadn't charged him with anything related to his wife's suspicious death. But inside the case files, the picture had already shifted. The fire wasn't random, the death wasn't accidental, and the digital evidence was no longer ignorable. On February 4, 2025, John was officially arrested, not for murder but for third-degree possession of child sexual abuse material stemming from the files extracted from the Samsung tablet discovered months earlier. The charge carried weight but not the full gravity of what investigators believed had taken place. The strategy was clear: secure a charge that would hold in court while continuing to build the homicide case quietly in parallel. At the Danbury Superior Court, John appeared with a public defender and said nothing beyond confirming his identity. Bail was set at $10,000, a figure that drew criticism once the charge was made public. Within hours, he posted bond and walked out. No ankle monitor, no travel restriction beyond the standard conditions. Just a man under investigation, walking free in the same county where a fire had killed his wife under suspicious circumstances. The public learned about the child pornography charge through official release, but the context behind it, the tablet, the image of Bindu, the alias emails, remained sealed under the broader death investigation. That sealed status wouldn't last long. 2 weeks later, on February 19th, the News Times ran a story confirming that John Fairchild was the subject of an ongoing fire-related death inquiry. A spokesperson for the state police declined to confirm whether the death had been reclassified as a homicide, but by that point, no one in the local press was calling it an accident. Internal court records showed that prosecutors had quietly filed a motion to preserve all digital and physical evidence for a future potential homicide indictment. It wasn't a charge, but it was the first procedural step toward one. The effect inside the community was immediate. A vigil held for Bindu in early March drew more than 60 people, many of whom admitted they had never spoken to her when she was alive. They just wanted to acknowledge that something had gone wrong and that silence wasn't acceptable anymore. Inside the state's attorney's office, the homicide unit met 3 times across February to review the evolving evidence stack. Forensics confirmed accelerant placement and fire staging. Autopsy confirmed death occurred before the fire. The flosser with unknown DNA remained unlinked. The burned photograph of Bindu recovered from the tablet had no legal function, but it framed context. The fire insurance rider from January 2024 had still not been explained. The burner accounts and encrypted messaging hinted at digital concealment prior to the incident. No one item pointed to murder beyond reasonable doubt. But the entirety of behavior, layered and deliberate, had begun to form something more difficult to ignore, a motive based not in rage, but in risk management. Detectives flagged a critical detail often overlooked in narrative cases like this. John Fairchild had not made a single proactive inquiry about the status of his wife's case since April 28, 2024, just 1 day after she was found dead. No follow-up with police, no public statement, no engagement with legal counsel about the death. From the outside, it was detachment. From inside the case file, it was calculated disengagement. That silence became part of the case. The last week of February, detectives re-interviewed the fire marshal and forensic pathologist to reconfirm the official cause of death. The cause remained undetermined, but the cumulative indicators, lack of smoke inhalation, blunt trauma, absence of natural fire patterns, now gave prosecutors leverage to request expert reclassification under suspected homicide for strategic court use. The goal wasn't just a trial, it was preservation of leverage. As one case agent noted during the status review, the fire didn't finish what it was supposed to, and now we've got to move before he figures out how to disappear for good. The fire didn't just destroy evidence, it tried to erase a person. By July 2025, DNA confirmed the burned remains in Unit 310 belonged to Bindu Patel. Her bones showed signs of trauma, fractures near the neck and ribs. The fire was set after she was already dead. Chemical analysis revealed an accelerant in the bedroom. There was no electrical fault. The fire was no accident. John's digital devices told the rest of the story. 2 days before Bindu vanished, he created a note about moving insurance money. His web history included searches on disappearing someone and how long it takes a body to burn. Investigators also found child sexual abuse material on his laptop, which kept him behind bars while they built the homicide case. Forensics found traces of Bindu's clothing melted into the sleeve of John's hoodie. He'd claimed he hadn't seen her in days. That was a lie. Her last known digital activity stopped at 10:42 p.m., February 18th. She was never seen again. Despite the mounting evidence, prosecutors haven't charged John with murder yet. They're cautious. The body was mostly destroyed. The timeline relies on forensics, not eyewitnesses. But a civil wrongful death lawsuit filed by Bindu's mother in July may pressure a formal charge. There's no twist ending here, no last-minute confession, just data, blood traces, and a timeline too precise to ignore. Bindu wasn't missing. She was murdered. No one expects the monster to be someone they once loved. But if there's anything I've learned from telling this story, it's this. Silence enables cruelty. If you feel unsafe, if your instincts are whispering that something's wrong, listen. Documentation saves lives. Patterns don't lie. And justice takes time, but it doesn't forget. We tell these stories not to scare, but to prepare. What happened to Bindu could happen in any zip code, but together, we can make sure it doesn't. If this video resonated with you, leave a comment where you're watching from, what stood out, or what justice means to you. And if it didn't, tell me why. Either way, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Every story matters, especially yours.